The morning Elsie Garner rode out to tell Edgar Finley goodbye forever, she found his bay horse already saddled, his bedroll already tied, and the man himself standing in the door of his stable with his hat in his hands and something quiet and certain in his dark eyes, as though he had known she was coming before she even knew it herself. The town of Harlan Creek, Texas sat on the edge of the hill country like a man leaning against a fence post, tired, sun-bleached, not entirely sure it wanted to stand up straight again. It was the spring of 1878, and the land had been dry for 2 seasons running, and the people who lived in it had been dry too, in the way that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with hope. The cattle trails were shifting north and west, and the men who had built their livelihoods on the old routes were finding themselves looking at empty roads and wondering whether stubbornness was the same thing as courage. Elsie had turned 24 that February, in a small house on the edge of town that had belonged to her father before a lung fever took him the winter prior. She was not a woman given to self-pity, which was perhaps why grief had carved her out so cleanly. She had nothing inside to soften the blow, no habit of tears or wailing, just a sharpness behind her gray eyes that people in town sometimes mistook for coldness. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, and she kept her boots polished even when there was no occasion for it, because her father had told her once that the way a person kept their boots told you everything about how they expected the world to treat them. She had been managing the small dry goods store her father left her since October, and she had been failing at it, not dramatically, not in any way that made good gossip, but in the slow arithmetic way of a woman who took in just barely less than she spent, month after month, until one morning in late March, she sat down with her ledger and saw the number at the bottom of the page and understood with calm and total clarity that she could not stay. She had a cousin in Santa Fe. Margaret was her name, and she had written twice in the past year with open invitations, and Elsie had twice declined them, because declining felt like choosing to stay and choosing to stay felt like choosing her father. But her father was gone, and the store was failing, and the house had a leak in the roof she could not afford to fix, and the town of Harlan Creek had begun to feel less like home and more like a very long sentence she had been serving without understanding the crime. So she made her decision on a Tuesday evening, and she spent Wednesday settling accounts, and she wrote Margaret a letter on Thursday morning, and by Friday she had sold the store, at a loss, to old Herman Clasp, who already owned the feed store 2 buildings down and had been waiting her out with the patient malice of a man who thought everything was just a matter of time. She sold the house, too, to the pastor's brother-in-law for less than it was worth, and she told no one in town except Mabel Prout, who ran the post office and who would tell everyone else so Elsie would not have to. The one person she had not told was Edgar Finley. She had been turning that particular problem over in her mind since Wednesday, and she still had not solved it by Friday afternoon, when she rode out to his property on the borrowed gray mare that belonged to the livery stable. Edgar's place was 3 miles east of town, a modest spread of perhaps 90 acres with a small house, a proper stable, and a paddock where he kept 4 working horses and 1 old mule that did not work anymore, but that Edgar fed anyway because, as he had once told her with perfect seriousness, the mule had opinions about retirement and deserved to have them respected. She had known Edgar Finley for 2 years, which was not as long as it felt and perhaps longer than she had admitted to herself. He had come to Harlan Creek in the autumn of 1876, arriving on a dusty Thursday with a horse, a toolbox, and a reputation as a fair hand with anything mechanical, a wagon wheel, a busted pump, a seized-up windmill. He had built his place on land that nobody else had wanted because of a rocky rise at the east end that made plowing impractical, but he had never intended to plow it. He shod horses and repaired equipment, and occasionally served as a deputy when Sheriff Mulray needed an extra set of eyes, and he lived quietly and without complaint, and was regarded by most of the town as a solid and decent man, which in Harlan Creek in 1878 was about the highest compliment the place had to offer. He was 28 years old, with brown hair that went lighter in the summer and dark eyes that went very still when he was paying close attention, which was most of the time. He was not a tall man, but he was built like someone had assembled him with care wide at the shoulder, sure in his movements, with hands that were rough from work but precise in everything they did. He had a way of listening to people that made them feel heard, which was rarer in that country than good water, and he smiled infrequently enough that when he did, people tended to notice it. He had noticed Elsie Garner in November of 1876, when she had come into the stable to pick up her father's draft horse after Edgar had reset its left rear shoe. She had examined the work without asking him to explain it, running her fingers along the clinches with a practiced eye, and then she had looked up and said, "You did it right," in a tone that suggested she was mildly surprised, and he had said, "I try to," and that had been their entire first conversation, and yet he had thought about it for 3 days afterward. Their acquaintance had grown slowly and without hurry, the way things grew in dry country with patience, with shallow roots that went very deep when the rain finally came. She had brought her father's horse to him twice more that winter, and in the spring he had helped her move several heavy crates from the back storeroom of the dry goods store when she could not find anyone else to do it. And by summer they had developed the habit of speaking to each other when their paths crossed in town, which was more often than either of them arranged, and less often than either of them would have chosen. Her father's death had changed things. He had come to the service, which was not unusual. Most of the town came, but he had stayed afterward when the crowd thinned, and he had not tried to say anything clever or comforting. He had simply stood near her, steady and solid as the cedar posts holding up the churchyard fence, and at one point when the afternoon wind came up and stirred the dust, and she had pressed her lips together very hard to keep from making a sound, his hand had briefly covered hers where it rested on the fence rail, and then withdrawn, and neither of them had mentioned it. Since then, she had brought him a pie on no particular occasion in December. He had ridden into town to check on her during the ice storm in January, and had repaired her kitchen pump without being asked while he was there. In February, she had sat with him on his porch in the mild evening of an unseasonable warm spell, and they had talked for 2 hours about everything, and nothing about whether the cattle drives would come back, about a book she had been reading, about whether the new telegraph line would reach Harlan Creek before the decade was out. And when she had finally stood to leave, he had walked with her to where the gray mare was tied, and he had said, with the careful tone of a man choosing his words the way a jeweler chooses his tools, "I like talking to you, Elsie." And she had said, "I like it too." And then she had ridden home in the dark with something warm and anxious sitting in the middle of her chest that she had not known what to do with. She still did not know what to do with it, and now she was leaving and she had to go tell him. The problem, and she had been honest with herself about this, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her on Wednesday night, was that she was not entirely sure what she was going to lose by going. She knew what she was going to gain: a fresh start, a cousin who wanted her there, a town that did not know the particular shape of her grief. But the thing with Edgar Finley had never been named or defined, and so she could not calculate its weight or measure how much it would hurt to set it down. She had told herself, riding out on Friday afternoon with the sun slanting long and gold across the Cedar Hills, that she was going to be straightforward about it. She would tell him she was leaving, that it was decided, that she hoped they had been friends, and that she was grateful for everything. She would not make it strange or sad. She would shake his hand if that was what he offered, and she would ride away, and she would not look back from the crest of the hill. That was the plan. The plan did not survive contact with the reality of him standing in the stable door, hat in hand, horse already saddled behind him. She pulled the gray mare up in the yard and looked at him for a moment without speaking, because what was there to say to that? His bay horse, the good one he called Captain, a steady animal with a broad chest, and kind eyes stood just inside the stable door with his saddle on, and his saddlebags packed, and his bridle hanging on the post, ready to be put on. Edgar's own bedroll was tied to the back of the saddle with the economy of someone who had done it many times. His rifle was in the scabbard. His coat was on the post beside it. "You are already packed," Elsie said finally. "I am," Edgar said. He was turning his hat in his hand slowly, which she had learned was what he did when he was managing something he did not entirely trust himself to manage. "Mabel told me this morning." Of course Mabel had. Elsie felt a flash of something, not quite irritation, because she had known this would happen, and then the flash passed, and she was left with the strange feeling of having had her speech taken away from her before she could give it. "I came to tell you I was leaving," she said. It seemed important to say it anyway. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for you to come." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that had been very carefully held in place, finding it could not hold quite any more. "I want to come with you." The words fell into the afternoon quiet with the weight of something that had been carried a long distance. Elsie looked at him. She looked at the packed horse. She looked back at him. "Edgar," she began. "I know it is not what you came here for," he said. He was not rushing the words, not stumbling over them. He had clearly had most of the morning to think about this, and the thinking showed. "And I know you have made your plan, and that your plan is good, and that you do not need my company to carry it out. You are more capable than just about anyone I know, and if you ride to Santa Fe alone, you will arrive there fine and you will build yourself a good life." He paused. His jaw tightened briefly. "But I have spent 2 years in this town, and the only reason I am still here is standing in front of me on that horse right now, and I would rather say it plainly and have you tell me no than say nothing and watch you ride over that hill." He met her eyes steadily. "So I am asking you, will you let me come?" Elsie sat very still on the gray mare for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 10 seconds. She had spent 2 days preparing herself to say goodbye to this man, and she had done the work of it. She had really done the work. She had told herself all the sensible things, that nothing had been declared, that she was being practical, that her life needed rebuilding and she could not wait for something that might never become itself. She had rehearsed the goodbye so many times it had worn smooth in her mind, a river stone, and she had thought she was ready. She had not been ready for this. "You would leave Harlan Creek," she said carefully. "Leave your property, your work." "I would," he said simply. "You have built something here." "I have built walls and a roof," he said. "Those are not the same thing as something." He held her gaze. "I know what I am saying, Elsie. I am not a man who speaks without thinking it through." That was true. She knew that about him better than almost anything else. She looked at the packed horse one more time, and then she looked at Edgar Finley in his stable doorway with his hat turning in his hands, and his whole life apparently reorganized with a morning's worth of decision. And she felt the carefully maintained composure of the past 2 days develop a crack that started somewhere behind her sternum and spread outward with alarming speed. "You were already packed," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. "I was," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more serious than a smile. "I thought you might need some time to get used to the idea, so I thought if I was already ready it might help." Elsie laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and neither had he apparently, because he blinked, and then the serious set of his mouth broke open into a proper smile, rare and warm, and she thought with sudden and total clarity, "There it is. There is the thing I could not calculate the weight of. Here it is sitting in the open air between us, and I have been a complete fool to think I could just set it down and ride away." "All right," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "All right, Edgar, you can come." Something in him went very still for one moment, and then he turned back into the stable with the deliberate movements of a man who had been prepared for a different answer and was taking a moment to readjust himself to the better one. She heard him take Captain's bridle off the post and heard the soft jingle of the bit being settled into place. And when he came back out, he was leading the bay horse and his coat was on, and his hat was on his head, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had just walked out of one chapter of his life and into another, and was carrying himself with the steady intention that the next one would be worth the walk. They rode out of his yard together just as the sun touched the tops of the cedar hills and turned the whole western sky the color of a coal fire. He did not reach for her hand or say anything romantic or press the moment into any shape that it was not. He simply rode beside her close enough that she was aware of his presence with every step of the horses, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that does not require filling. "We will need supplies," Elsie said when they came to the edge of town. "I have some," he said. "Enough for 2 or 3 days if we are careful. We can resupply at Fredericksburg. That is on the way." "Yes," he said. "I looked at the maps this morning." She turned to look at him. "You looked at the maps?" "After Mabel told me," he said, without a trace of apology. "I thought it was better to be useful than to be surprised." She turned back to the road ahead, and she was smiling, and she let herself smile, because there was no one on this particular stretch of road to see it, and because it felt like something she had been keeping in reserve for exactly this. They stopped at her house, her former house now, she supposed, with the strange vertigo of ownership transferred, to collect the 2 bags she had packed. He helped her tie them to the gray mare's saddle without comment, working quickly and efficiently, and when she took one last look at the small limestone house with its leaking roof and its empty rooms, he stood a little apart from her and let her have the moment without filling it. "Goodbye," she said, to the house or to her father or to both. Then she turned away, and she mounted up, and they rode south out of Harlan Creek in the gathering dusk, and the town did not see them go except for old Mrs. Harkin on her front porch, who raised a hand in farewell that might have been a wave or might have been her reaching for her pipe. It was impossible to tell. The first night they made camp in a cedar hollow about 15 miles south of town, where a small spring came up clean and cold from between 2 limestone outcroppings, and the wind came through the trees with the smell of the hill country in spring cedar oil and fresh grass, and the distant promise of water in the draws. Edgar built the fire with efficiency and without fuss, and Elsie laid out the food she had packed: dried beef, biscuits wrapped in cloth, some hard cheese and dried apricots, and they sat across the fire from each other and ate in the comfortable silence of people who have established, in some unspoken way, that the silence between them is the right kind. "You do not have to do this," she said at one point. She was not sure why she said it, maybe because it was still sitting in her, that old habit of making sure the people around her had full information before they made their choices. He looked at her across the fire. "You said that already, or a version of it." "I know," she said. "I suppose I want to make sure you heard it." "I heard it," he said. He poked the fire with a stick, and the coals shifted and sent up a small constellation of sparks. "I will tell you something, Elsie. I have been careful most of my life. I have thought things through, and I have not rushed myself, and I have not made declarations that I was not prepared to stand behind." He paused, looking into the fire. "This is one of those declarations." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the cedar dark, a nighthawk called. "How long have you been thinking about it?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness she had come to associate with all his answers to questions that mattered. "Since the ice storm in January," he said. "When I was riding into town to make sure you were all right, I was thinking about the fact that I was not worried in the way a neighbor is worried for a neighbor. I was worried in a different way. And I thought that is probably important information." She looked at him. The firelight moved across his face, catching the angles of it. "And you said nothing. You had just lost your father," he said quietly, "and you were keeping yourself upright by sheer force of will, and the last thing you needed was a man asking you to take on something else." He met her eyes. "So I waited." Elsie was quiet for a moment. There was something in her throat that she needed to swallow past. "I should have said something," she said. "Before I decided to leave, I do not know, I should have said something." "You were being practical," he said. "There is nothing wrong with that." "I was hiding behind it," she said. She had not admitted this to herself until she said it aloud, and it landed with the specific weight of a true thing. He did not tell her that was not true because it was true and he knew it and she knew it and they both knew that neither of them was the kind of person who needed false comfort. He just looked at her steadily across the fire and after a moment he said, "Well, here we are now." "Here we are now," she agreed. She slept well that night, which surprised her. She had expected the open air and the unfamiliarity and the strange new landscape of everything she had just walked into to keep her awake, turning the situation over in her mind. Instead, she fell asleep quickly, with the sound of the horses moving quietly in the cedar dark and the fire settling into coals, and she did not dream, and she woke before dawn feeling rested for the first time in months. Edgar was already up. He had coffee on by the time she came fully awake, and there was something so ordinary and good about that, the smell of coffee in the cold morning air, the sound of the fire revived that she sat with it for a moment before she spoke. "You did not sleep," she said. "I slept some," he said. He handed her a tin cup. "I am a light sleeper in new places. It is an old habit." She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the sky, which was turning from black to deep blue to the pale gray of earliest morning, the hills silhouetted against it like a watercolor that had not yet dried. "What made you come to Harlan Creek?" she asked. She had never asked him this directly, though she had wondered. He settled back against his saddle, which he had been using as a backrest. "I was in San Antonio before," he said, "working in a machine shop there. It was good work, steady. But the city was getting bigger every year and I kept feeling like I was getting smaller in proportion to it." He paused, looking at the horizon. "I wanted something where you could see the edges. Where the work was yours and the space was yours, and if something went wrong you could look at it directly and know exactly what needed to be fixed. And Harlan Creek gave you that." "Mostly," he said. He looked at her. "It gave me most of it." She understood what he meant and she let it sit there between them, warm as the coffee. They broke camp when the sun came up and rode south through the cedar and limestone country of the hill country, where the roads were rocky and the views were long, and the sky was a shade of blue that seemed specific to Texas in the spring. A blue that had more depth to it than a plain blue sky should rightfully have, as though someone had added something extra to it. The road was not much traveled at this hour, and they rode side by side where the trail was wide enough and single file where it narrowed, and they talked more freely than they had in town, in the way that movement and open country sometimes loosened things that enclosed spaces held tight. He told her about growing up in central Tennessee, in a small farm town near Murfreesboro, and about the war that had cut through that country like a plow through bad ground and left everything turned up and raw. He had been too young to fight, just barely, and he had spent several years afterward learning what the men who had come home had to teach him about survival and practical work, and the particular value of not wasting things. His father had been a wheelwright and his grandfather had been a blacksmith, and the knowledge had come down to him in the way of old country skills, not through formal teaching but through proximity, through watching, through doing things wrong until you understood why they had to be done right. She told him about her own childhood, about following her father through the dry goods store as a girl and learning the business before she knew she was learning it, about the way her father had taught her numbers and accounts the same way he taught her everything, not as lessons but as conversations, not as rules but as the natural logic of things. She told him about her mother who had died when Elsie was 11, of something the doctor had called a fever but that she suspected now, with adult understanding, had been a broken heart dressed up in physical symptoms. Her mother had been a woman of enormous feeling and the country had not always been kind to women of enormous feeling. "You are not like her," Edgar said, not unkindly. "No," Elsie agreed. "I learned not to be." She paused. "Sometimes I think I overcorrected." He glanced at her. "I do not think so. I think you are exactly who you need to be. You are just you keep a lot in a very small space." She looked at him. "Is that a criticism?" "It is an observation," he said. "I do not think things that are true are criticisms." He held her gaze for a moment before turning back to the road. "Though for what it is worth, I think the space is bigger than you let on. I have seen what is inside it." She did not answer that directly, because it undid something in her that she was not ready to have undone while they were still on horseback in the middle of the hill country with 15 miles still to go before Fredericksburg. But she filed it away in the careful way she filed important things, in the place behind her sternum where the important things lived. They reached Fredericksburg in the early afternoon. It was a German settlement town, orderly and prosperous in its way, with wide streets and stone buildings that looked like they intended to be there for a long time. They restocked at the general store more dried provisions, ammunition for both their firearms, a fresh candle and some matches, and a newspaper from Austin that was 2 weeks old, but which represented the current state of the world as far as this country was concerned. The store proprietor, a heavy-set man named Brower with a careful English that carried the shape of German beneath it, looked at them with the frank assessment of a man who ran a business on a road traveled by people of all varieties, and charged them a fair price without comment. They ate a proper meal at the town's small hotel restaurant, beans and salt pork and cornbread and coffee that was significantly better than trail coffee, and sat at a table by the window with the newspaper between them. And for a while they were just two people having lunch, which was also somehow entirely different from anything else, because they were two people having lunch and riding together, and it was beginning to feel, in some molecular and definitive way, like something. Santa Fe is still a long way, Edgar said, looking at the map he had unfolded on the table beside the newspaper. Yes, she said, about 350 miles, maybe more depending on the route. She had been thinking about this carefully in the way she thought about practical things. We will go through San Angelo and then north through the Staked Plains country. It will be drier, but there is less trouble that way. Less trouble, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. You were thinking of a different route, she said. I was thinking about Comanche Spring, he said. There is a stage road that goes through there that is better watered. But there has been some difficulty. I heard about that, she said. She had. The newspapers had been carrying reports for months about conflicts in that country, the sustained and brutal effort of the army to push the Comanche and Kiowa bands off the land they had lived on for generations, and the retaliatory violence that ran in both directions, and the particular hell it made of the roads through that country for anyone passing through. The northern route is longer but safer, he nodded. Agreed. She folded the map and handed it back to him, and their fingers overlapped briefly at the corner, and neither of them moved for just a moment longer than was necessary. Then she withdrew her hand and picked up her coffee cup, and he folded the map with his usual precision, and outside the window of the hotel restaurant, Fredericksburg went about its quiet business in the afternoon sun. They left town in the middle of the afternoon and made another 12 miles before the sun went down, camping near a creek bed with enough water still running in it to water the horses and fill their canteens. The second night was different from the first in the particular way that second nights always are. The strangeness had worn off, and what was left was something more comfortable and more honest, and they sat closer to the fire than they had the night before, their conversation ranging freely over more personal ground. He told her about a woman he had known in San Antonio, briefly, named Cecilia, and how it had not worked out because she had wanted things he could not give her: a permanent city life, a social position, the settled certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was and would never surprise her. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact, the way you might describe a road that turned out to go in the wrong direction. You had still traveled it. It had still taught you something about the territory. She told him about the man her father had hoped she would marry, a merchant named Calloway in a town 2 days east, who had been decent and prosperous, and entirely without the quality that she had never been able to name but always been able to sense, the quality that made a person feel like the world was larger and more interesting in their company than it was without them. She had told her father gently that she could not marry a man just because he was decent and prosperous. Her father had been quiet for a long moment and then had said, with the rueful honesty of a man who had loved her mother for exactly that unnamed quality. "No, I suppose you cannot." "Your father sounds like he understood a great deal," Edgar said. "He understood the important things," Elsie said. "He was not always practical about the ordinary ones. He let the store slide in his last year because he was too tired to keep the accounts properly, and he did not tell me how bad it was until near the end. I think he was embarrassed." She paused. "I was not angry about it. I understood why, but I wish he had told me sooner so I could have helped him." Edgar was quiet for a moment. "You would have found a way to fix it," he said. "I would have tried," she said. "You always try," he said. "It is one of the things about you." She looked at him across the fire. The night had settled in fully around them, and the stars above the cedar hills were extraordinary, thick and close in the way they got in dark country far from towns, and his face in the firelight was familiar in a way that still surprised her when she noticed it. "One of the things," she repeated. "One of many things," he said, and held her gaze with that particular steadiness that she had long since stopped being able to look away from. She leaned forward and kissed him. She had not planned to. Or perhaps she had been planning to for a long time without acknowledging the plan. It did not matter. She leaned forward across the small space between them and kissed him, soft and deliberate. And for 1/2 second he was completely still, with the stillness of a man who has been given something he had been careful not to wish for too hard. And then he kissed her back, and it was warm and unhurried and exactly right. The way things are when they have been waiting long enough to know what they are. When she sat back, he looked at her with something in his expression that was not surprise exactly. He had been waiting too, she understood, but something more specific than that. Something like a man seeing a thing he had imagined for a long time and finding that the reality is finer than the imagining. "I should have done that in February," she said. "On your porch." "Yes," he said. "You should have." He was not reproachful. He was smiling, that rare full smile that changed his whole face. "But we are here now." "We are here now," she said. They did not rush anything further. They were practical people who had ridden a long way that day and had many more miles ahead of them. And the night was cold and the fire needed tending. And some things were better for not being hurried. Better for being let alone to grow in the dark the way good things grew. He added wood to the fire and she settled her bedroll closer to his than she had the previous night, and they talked a while longer about smaller things, the horses, the road tomorrow, whether the spring would hold through the month. And eventually the words grew few and comfortable and then absent, and she fell asleep listening to the fire settle and the night wind in the cedar, with his presence steady and warm at the edge of her awareness. And she thought, just before sleep took her, that this was what safe felt like. She had not been sure she remembered. The next several days on the road were among the finest she could remember, which surprised her, because there was nothing luxurious about them. They were long days of riding in the spring heat that built as they moved west out of the hill country and into the more open country beyond, camping in whatever shelter the land offered, eating trail food and drinking creek water run through a cloth, washing their faces in cold springs and mending their horses' feet with the tools Edgar carried. But the quality of the days was in the company, and the company was extraordinary. They talked without running out of things to say, which was the most remarkable thing Elsie had discovered about him. Not just that he was intelligent or thoughtful, though he was both, but that he was interested. He wanted to know what she thought about things, and he asked her, and he listened to the answers with his full attention, and then he told her what he thought, and his thinking was always worth hearing. They disagreed sometimes, genuinely and without heat, about things like whether the cattle trade would come back to Texas, or whether the new western routes were permanent, about the politics in Washington, and whether the Reconstruction had done what it should have, about 100 small things and a few large ones. And the disagreements felt like gifts rather than battles, because they were the texture of two genuine minds meeting honestly. She discovered that he could sketch. She found this out on the third day when they stopped at noon by a rocky creek, and while she attended to the gray mare's slightly tender right forefoot, She looked up and found him sitting on a flat rock with a small notebook and a pencil, his head bent, his hand moving with a focus she recognized from when he was working. She asked to see it when he was done, and he showed her a swift and accurate drawing of the creek and the cedar and the skyline, and then at the edge of the page, smaller, a quick sketch of her, standing at the mare's foot with her hat pushed back and her attention entirely on the task in her hands. She looked at the sketch for a long time. "I did not know you did this," she said. "I have always done it," he said. "It is how I think sometimes with my hands." "You made me look," she paused, trying to locate the right word. "Capable," he said, "because you are." He was watching her with that still, direct attention. "That is what I see when I look at you." She handed the notebook back to him. The sketch of her stayed in her mind for the rest of the day, the way a true thing does, not because it was flattering, but because it was accurate, and it showed her something about how he saw her that she had not known how to see herself. West of the hill country, the land opened up into something that had less pretense about it. Not harsh exactly, but honest flat-topped mesas in the distance, dry arroyos cut deep into pale rock, the grass shorter and more golden, the sky impossibly large. They were 2 weeks on the road when they reached the country near San Angelo, following the North Concho River into town on a morning that was already hot before 8 o'clock. San Angelo was a rougher place than Fredericksburg. It had the feel of a town that was still figuring itself out, with the army presence from nearby Fort Concho giving it a military restlessness, the saloons doing the steady business that army towns always provided, and a permanent undercurrent of tension that came from being right at the edge of country that was still, in very real ways, contested. They kept to themselves, resupplied at the general store, and took the opportunity to sleep one night in the town's modest rooming house, which was a luxury after 2 weeks of open ground. Elsie lay in the narrow bed of the rooming house and looked at the plank ceiling and thought about the fact that they had been traveling together for 2 weeks, and she was more certain of him than she had been certain of anything in a long time. It was not a blinding certainty or a dramatic one. It was the deep, structural kind, the kind that did not depend on romantic moments or perfect circumstances, but on the accumulation of evidence gathered the way she gathered all evidence, carefully and without wishful editing. She trusted him. More than that, she liked him, genuinely and specifically, in the way that was different from admiring someone or being attracted to someone, though she was those things too. She liked who he was when he was tired, which was quieter than usual but never short with her. She liked who he was when he was frustrated, which happened occasionally on the road with a stuck cinch ring, with a stubborn horse, with a creek crossing that was deeper than it looked, and which he handled with an honest brief muttering to himself and then a return to competence, never taking it out on her. She liked who he was in the evenings by the fire, telling her things he had been thinking, asking her things he wanted to know. She liked, specifically and completely, the person he was. In the morning she told him so, or most of it, while they were saddling the horses in the small corral behind the rooming house. "I am glad to be doing this with you," she said. She had thought about it and decided that the plain version was better than any constructed version. "I want you to know that. I was not certain when we left, or I was certain, but I did not know what I was certain of. I am clearer now." He looked at her over Captain's back, where he was tightening the cinch. His expression was serious but warm. "What are you clear about?" he asked. She considered this for a moment because she wanted to say it right. "I am clear that I do not want to arrive in Santa Fe alone," she said. "I am clear that I want you to be there when we arrive. And I am clear that," she paused, and then committed to the rest of it, "that I want more than arriving. I want what comes after." He came around the horse and stood in front of her, not touching her yet, just looking at her with those steady dark eyes. "What comes after?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He cupped her face in both hands, those careful, precise hands, and kissed her, and this one was different from the one by the fire 2 weeks ago. It was still warm and unhurried, but it had more weight to it, more intention, the kind of kiss that was not an experiment but a confirmation. When he stepped back there was something resolved in his expression, something that had been under consideration and was now decided. "I have been thinking," he said, "that if you would have me, I would like to marry you." He said it simply and without flourish, the way he said things that he had thought through completely and was prepared to stand behind. "Not today, not tomorrow, not before we have given you time to settle into wherever we are going, but I want you to know that is the direction I am thinking in case it affects your thinking." Elsie looked at him. She thought about her father and his absolute certainty about her mother and the unnamed quality that made the world larger and more interesting. She thought about everything she had noted and catalogued and carefully refused to name for 2 years. She thought about the sketch in the notebook and the morning coffee and the way he listened and the way he was already packed. "It affects my thinking," she said, "in a favorable direction." He almost laughed. The smile broke through, full and warm, and she thought again. There it is, and this time she did not try to look away from it. "Good," he said, and he went back to finishing with Captain Cinch with the matter-of-fact air of a man who had said what needed to be said and was now returning to the practical work of the day. And Elsie went back to saddling the gray mare with the strange and enormous feeling of a woman who has just walked into the rest of her life and found it furnished better than she expected. They left San Angelo heading northwest, following a route that would take them up through the edge of the Staked Plains and then cut northwest toward New Mexico. The country out here was different again, larger and quieter, the mesas farther apart, the silence a physical presence. The road was less a road and more an agreement between travelers about which way to go, and they followed the old freight tracks that cut across the pale grass in wheel ruts worn deep enough to find even after the wind had been at them. On the third day out of San Angelo, they came up on a wagon sitting in the middle of the track with one wheel off, and a woman sitting on the wagon seat with the particular rigid dignity of a person who has decided not to panic yet, but is keeping the option close at hand. She was about 40, stoutly built, with red-brown hair going gray and a practical expression that assessed them without alarm as they came up. Her name was Nora Shelby, and she was traveling with her son, a boy of about 12 named Daniel, who was holding the horses with the concentrated focus of someone given an important job, from a homestead east of here that she had given up after her husband's death, heading to live with her brother in a town called Tucumcari in the New Mexico territory. The wheel had come off because a pin had sheared, and she had been sitting there for 2 hours watching the horizon for help. Edgar fixed it in 40 minutes. He had the tools for it and the knowledge of what to do, and he worked with the focused efficiency that was simply how he was in the physical world. And Daniel watched every step with the absolute attention of a boy learning something important. And Nora made coffee on a small iron stove she had in the back of the wagon with the comfort of a woman who was accustomed to making coffee under whatever circumstances presented themselves. When the wheel was back on and tested and declared sound, Nora pressed them to stay for supper, and they did, camping near her wagon and eating better than they had in days because Nora cooked with a competence born of long practice, and they talked around her fire in the way of people on the road who briefly become, through the logic of shared circumstance, something like neighbors. Daniel asked Edgar about the tools, and Edgar showed him the workings of the pin and the wheel with the patient explanatory manner he used when showing people things, never condescending, never making the person feel they should already know. Daniel was a serious, quiet boy who had recently lost his father and was carrying it with the compressed gravity of a child who has been told, in too many ways, to be strong. Edgar treated him like a small adult with a full interior life, which was what he was, and Elsie watched the boy's shoulders drop about 1.5 inches during the course of the conversation as something in him was given permission to set itself down. When they rode on the next morning, Nora clasped Elsie's hand at parting and said, with the frank directness of a woman who had earned the right to say true things, "That is a good man you have got there." She said it not as a question, "Yes," Elsie said, "he is." She rode away thinking about the ease with which she had said it, how it had not felt like a concession or a loss of ground, how it had felt simply and exactly like a true thing plainly stated. The staked plains were magnificent and terrible in the way of things that did not care about you one way or another. The sky was so vast out here that you could watch a storm build 100 miles away and track its progress over the course of a whole afternoon, a black curtain drawing across the pale blue distance. The grass was short and blond and endless, broken only by the occasional playa lake dried to a white crust of alkali, and the wind came from the northwest with a constancy that was almost musical once you stopped trying to fight it and let it push you along. They rode through a full day of that country without seeing another person, which Elsie found unexpectedly moving. The pure fact of being alone in something so large, just the two of them and the horses moving through the grass, while the sky processed its weather in slow, enormous movements above them. She had grown up in country she could see across, and she had always found large spaces clarifying rather than threatening. And Edgar, she found, was the same way. He rode with ease in the openness, and she thought again about what he had said in Fredericksburg about wanting to see the edges of things. She understood it differently now, out here where the edges were the horizon itself, and the horizon was everywhere. They talked less those days on the plains, not because there was less between them, but because the country seemed to call for a different register, less words, more presence, more attention paid to the land itself. They rode companionably close, and sometimes he reached across and briefly caught her hand between their horses, and sometimes she pointed out something in the sky or the grass and he nodded, and the communication that happened in those gestures was as complete as anything said in sentences. They crossed into New Mexico territory on a clear afternoon when the light was doing extraordinary things to the limestone escarpment that marked the shift from the flat plains to the broken country further west, and Elsie felt something in her chest open slightly, as though a window had been unlatched that had been closed for a long time. "We are in new country," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at the horizon with the interested attention he gave to everything new. "It suits you, I think." "I think it might," she said. The last stretch of road to Santa Fe went through country that changed every day. From the limestone breaks to the Pecos River Valley, to the slow climb through pinon and juniper into the high country around Santa Fe itself, where the air was different, thinner and cleaner, and scented with something Elsie could not name until Edgar identified it as the resin of the pinon pine, which she had not encountered before. The light was different too, sharper, clearer, the shadows harder-edged, the colors more saturated, the mountains to the east a deep blue-purple that looked painted. She felt alive in it in a way she had forgotten she could feel. They came into Santa Fe on a warm afternoon in early June, 5 weeks after leaving Harlan Creek, riding down the old road past the adobe buildings that gave the town its particular character, low and earth-colored and ancient-looking, as though they had grown up from the ground rather than being placed on it. The town was larger and more varied than anything they had come from, with a mix of Anglo settlers and old Spanish families, and a significant Pueblo presence that gave it a cultural richness that the raw Texas cattle towns completely lacked. The central plaza was busy with wagons and horses, and people going about their business in several languages. Elsie found her cousin Margaret's house on the east side of town, a proper adobe with a walled courtyard and a fountain that actually ran, a luxury that felt, after 5 weeks of creek water, almost absurdly generous. Margaret met them at the gate. She was 30, a few years older than Elsie, and looked like Elsie's father around the eyes in a way that caught Elsie off guard and sent something quick and sharp through her chest. Margaret was warm and direct, and immediately took charge of the situation with the confidence of a woman who had been managing a household in a foreign city for 6 years and was not easily surprised by anything. She looked at Edgar with frank assessment. She looked at Elsie. She looked back at Edgar. "You wrote that you were coming alone," Margaret said to Elsie. "The plan changed," Elsie said. "I see that," Margaret said. She studied Edgar for another moment with the evaluating gaze of someone who loved Elsie and was deciding about this man. "Can you work?" "Yes," Edgar said. "What can you do?" "Horses, metalwork, machinery, carpentry in a limited way, whatever needs doing." Margaret looked at Elsie one more time. "All right," she said, and opened the gate fully. "Come in, both of you." Margaret's husband was a man named Carrasco, Rafael Carrasco, a Santa Fe native whose family had been in the territory for 3 generations. He was a quiet, steady man with a wry humor that emerged sideways in conversations, and he took Edgar's measure over the course of the first dinner with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who was in no particular hurry, but was not going to miss anything important. By the end of the evening, they were deep in a conversation about hydraulics and the town's water system that Elsie followed with half her attention and found entirely satisfying as evidence. Margaret sat beside Elsie after dinner in the courtyard where the fountain made its small clear sound in the night air. "Tell me," Margaret said simply. Elsie told her. She told her about the store and the ledger and the house with the leaking roof, and about arriving at Edgar's stable and finding him already packed. She told her about the road, the campfires, the conversations, the staked planes, the woman with the broken wheel. She told her about the kiss by the fire and what he had said in San Angelo. Margaret listened without interrupting, which Elsie appreciated. "He sounds like he is very real," Margaret said when Elsie was done. "He is entirely real," Elsie said. "That is the exact word for it." Margaret looked at the fountain in the courtyard. "Papa would have liked him," she said. Elsie's throat tightened briefly. "Yes," she said. "He would have." They stayed with Margaret and Raphael for the first weeks while Edgar found work, which took him 3 days, because the town had a blacksmith but not a proper mechanic, and there was enough broken equipment and neglected machinery in any western town in 1878 to keep a skilled man busy indefinitely. He found a small adobe building on a side street that could serve as a shop and negotiated a fair rental for it. And within a week, he was bringing in work from the surrounding ranches and the Army Supply Depot at the edge of town, and the shop began to develop the particular smell of hot metal and oil and cedar smoke that Elsie associated, now irrevocably, with competence and home. She, meanwhile, was learning Santa Fe. She was good at learning places. She had her father's eye for the practical landscape of a town, its commerce and its gaps. She found within 2 weeks that the town had several competing dry goods operations, but nothing that served the specific needs of the ranchero community efficiently, particularly in terms of specific household goods and the kind of fine dry provisions that the older Santa Fe families valued. She spent her days walking, watching, talking to people in her imperfect but improving Spanish. She had some schoolbook knowledge of it, and Margaret was a patient teacher. And by the end of the first month she had a plan. She talked it through with Edgar in the evenings, spreading her notes on the table in the small room Margaret had given them. They were sharing a room by this point, with Margaret's cheerful tacit approval and Raphael's complete absence of comment, and he listened to her think through the business with the attentive quality that she had come to know was his fullest attention. "You have enough money?" he asked when she had laid it out. "Most of it," she said. "The proceeds from the house and store. If I am careful about the initial stock, it is enough to start. And the location. There is a space on the south side of the plaza," she said. "The rent is fair. The foot traffic is good. The woman who owns the building is named Aguilar, and she has a reputation for honoring her agreements." He looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. "Then do it," he said. The directness of it made her smile. "You are not going to tell me to be careful or to think about it more?" she asked. "You have already been careful and thought about it more," he said. "That is what all of this is." He indicated the notes with a slight movement. "I am not going to pretend to be more cautious than you are as a strategy for seeming responsible. You have done the work. The numbers make sense. Do it." She reached across the notes and took his hand, and he turned it over and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight while the Santa Fe night came on outside the window. She opened the store in August of 1878. She called it Garner's Provisions, because her name was Garner and she was proud of her father and proud of what she was building, and because she had decided, somewhere on the road through the staked plains, that she was done with being cautious about taking up space. The store was small but well organized, and she stocked it with the specific eye of someone who had been learning the community for 2 months, and on the first day she had 11 customers, and on the second day she had 20, and by the end of the first week she had a waiting list for several items that she ordered with the confident dispatch of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret came in on the third day and stood in the middle of the store and turned slowly, looking at everything. "Papa would have been very proud of you," she said. Elsie was behind the counter entering figures in her ledger, and she looked up and said, "I know," and meant it without sadness for possibly the first time. Edgar proposed properly in October. They had been to a dinner at the home of a rancher named Delgado who had been bringing his wagon repair work to the shop, and who had invited them as a gesture of the neighborly integration that Santa Fe practiced in its particular layered way. It had been a large and lively evening with several families, good food, music after dinner, and the kind of conviviality that made you feel the world was large and full of good things. They had ridden home on borrowed horses in the October night, which in Santa Fe at altitude was clear and cold with a moon so bright it threw shadows, and the old adobe buildings of the town were silver and beautiful in it. He had stopped the horses at the gate of Margaret's courtyard and dismounted, and when he helped her down unnecessary, she could dismount perfectly well herself, but she had long since understood that this was how he moved in the world, with care and intention, and she had stopped pretending she did not find it moving. He had not let go of her hands when her feet were on the ground. He went down on one knee in the moonlight on the Santa Fe street, and she felt her throat close and her eyes go bright in a way she would not have predicted and was not embarrassed by. "I have been thinking about this since San Angelo," he said, looking up at her with those steady dark eyes. "And I have a ring. I found it at a silversmith here. It is a Santa Fe piece, nothing like Tennessee or Texas." He produced it from his coat pocket, a simple silver band set with a small turquoise stone in the style of the territory's craftsmen, which was exactly the right thing for exactly the right place and time. "And I would like to ask you properly. Will you marry me, Elsie Garner?" She pulled him up off his knee and kissed him and said yes, and then said yes again when he asked if she was certain, and then said, "Edgar Finley, you were already packed," which was apparently going to be the private language of everything between them, because he laughed, the full open laugh that she had never heard before the road, and that was now one of the best sounds she knew. The wedding was in November, in the small Catholic church on the plaza that Margaret attended, with a dispensation arranged because Edgar was not Catholic, but Raphael had useful relationships with the local padre, who was a pragmatic and warm-hearted man who believed that the institution of marriage was more important than its denominations. They had a civil ceremony the day before as well, to satisfy all possible legalities in the office of the alcalde, and then the church ceremony, and then a dinner at Margaret and Raphael's that went on until midnight and included what felt like half the town, because Margaret had a gift for this kind of gathering and had used it generously on their behalf. Elsie wore a dress of dark blue wool that a seamstress named Alina had made in 3 weeks' worth of careful evenings, and she had flowers from the market in her hair, and she was told by several people, beautiful, which she accepted with more ease than she would have managed 6 months prior, because she had spent 6 months being seen clearly by someone whose opinion she trusted absolutely, and it had changed something in how she received things. Edgar wore his good dark coat and a string tie that Raphael had lent him and looked, she thought privately, exactly like himself, which was the best possible version. He held her hands at the altar with the same quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered, full, quiet, unhurried, certain. And when the padre asked the questions and he gave the answers, his voice was steady and clear, and she matched its steadiness for steadiness, certainty for certainty, because she had been raised to say what she meant and mean what she said. They had a room of their own by then, in a small house they were renting 2 streets from the shop, a sensible and modest adobe with a kitchen garden, and a stable for the horses, and a fireplace in the main room that drew well. It was exactly the right size for the life they were building, neither too small to move in nor too large to fill with meaning. The first winter in Santa Fe was cold in the specific way of high desert cold, dramatic and dry, with bright blue skies over the mountains and frost that came in hard at night and lifted by mid-morning. They were warm inside it. The shop was busy through the winter because wagons and equipment did not stop breaking when the weather changed, and the store did steady business, and in the evenings they came home to each other, and to the fire and the small accumulating domesticity of a shared life. His books and her ledgers on the same table, his tools cleaned and hung at the door, her kitchen garden's rosemary dried and hanging in the kitchen. Both of them learning the particular grammar of a household made of 2 people who were accustomed to managing alone. It was a good grammar. They were both careful people who were not afraid of honesty, and they had established early on the habit of saying the thing rather than the version of the thing that was easier to say, which meant that their disagreements were real but brief, and their repairs were complete. They did not manage each other. They trusted each other with the clean trust of people who had earned it by being trustworthy. In the spring, Elsie told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen garden on a morning in March, while she was looking at the rosemary to see if it had survived the winter, which it had. She had known for 2 weeks and had been carrying the knowledge with the same careful interior attention she gave to important things, making sure it was real, making sure she understood what she felt about it, which was happy. Specifically and fully happy, in the way that surprised her, not because happiness was foreign to her, but because this particular happiness was so exact, so suited to the moment and the person and the place. He put down the coffee cup he was holding and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, then the rapid reordering of everything in response to the surprise, then something that settled into a warmth so deep and complete that she felt it from across the garden. He crossed to her and put his arms around her and held her carefully, as though she were something he wanted to be sure he did not drop. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am completely well. I am better than I have been in a long time." He held her for another moment and then stepped back and looked at her with that direct and serious gaze. "I am going to be good at this," he said, with the earnest certainty of a man making a promise he had thought through. "I do not know everything about it yet, but I am going to pay attention and I am going to be good at it." She laughed, and it was the full sound, the one she had been carrying inside her for years without letting out. "I know," she said. "I know you will." Margaret, when told, immediately and practically expanded her roster of helpful interventions to include preparing Elsie for childbirth with the honest matter-of-fact information that their mother's generation had not thought to provide, drawing on the knowledge of the women in Santa Fe's various communities with the networked efficiency of a woman who had made herself well-connected for exactly these purposes. She brought the midwife around to meet Elsie in April, a Pueblo woman named Yolanda who had been attending births in the territory for 20 years and who had the calm authority of someone who had seen everything and found most of it manageable. Elsie took to Yolanda immediately. She liked competence, and Yolanda had it in abundance. Edgar, for his part, read everything available on the subject, which was not as much as he would have liked but was something, and he asked Yolanda intelligent questions at their second meeting that earned her unsmiling but genuine approval. He also, quietly and without making a production of it, reorganized the house so that everything Elsie might need in the later months was accessible and comfortable. And he did not attempt to diminish the discomforts of her first trimester by telling her she would feel better soon, because he understood from his reading and from the evidence in front of him that the correct response to someone feeling unwell was not a prediction but a presence. And so he was present, steady and warm, and ready to be useful in whatever specific way was needed. Summer came again to Santa Fe, and Elsie's store was a year old and had outgrown itself, and she hired a young woman named Rosa, 16, recently arrived from a village to the south, quick and reliable, to help 3 days a week. And she expanded the back storeroom and added a line of household goods that served the ranchero families, and which she had sourced on a trip to Albuquerque with Edgar in May, a trip that had been both a buying expedition and something like a honeymoon. The proper one they had not had time for in the fall. She was large with the baby by August, and she ran the store from a chair behind the counter with the same unruffled efficiency as when she had been running it on her feet, because nothing about her personality required physical mobility, and her mind was as clear and organized as it had always been. Edgar came to the store every day at noon, which was officially so she could give him lunch and unofficially so he could look at her in that specific way that made her feel seen and certain. And Rosa had stopped trying to suppress her smile about this and simply let it sit on her face. The baby came in late September, which was how Yolanda had calculated it. Labor started on a Sunday morning and concluded, with no complications but considerable work on Elsie's part, in the early evening of the same day. Edgar sat outside the closed bedroom door for most of it with the strained composure of a man who was very good at being calm in normal circumstances, and was discovering that this was not a normal circumstance. He heard her once make a sound that was not quite pain and not quite determination, but something that contained both, and he stood up and sat down twice in the space of 20 seconds, and then fixed himself in his chair with the specific effort of a man who had promised to be good at this. When Yolanda opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room with 3 steps that contained about 6 months' worth of feeling compressed into 12 feet of distance, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Elsie, who was exhausted and completely certain, and holding a very new person wrapped in cotton. And he did not say anything for a long moment because words had temporarily failed him, which was unusual enough that she noticed it and found it more touching than anything he could have said. "A boy," she said. "Yolanda says he is healthy." He reached out and very carefully put one large, careful hand over the back of the baby's head, and the baby, with the arbitrary and complete authority of new persons, turned slightly toward the warmth of the hand and made a sound. "Hello," Edgar said to the baby, in a voice Elsie had never heard from him before, softer and more undone and utterly himself. She reached out and took his other hand where it rested on the bed. He looked up at her, and there was something in his face that she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life, whatever the rest of her life turned out to hold. "Hello," she said. They named him James, for her father, whose full name had been James Garner and who had understood the unnamed quality that made the world larger and more interesting. It felt right and complete, a thread tied off properly, the past honored in the present. Margaret came the next morning with enough food to feed 10 people, and the specific expression of a woman who is trying very hard not to cry and is mostly succeeding. She held James for a long time, standing by the window in the morning light, looking at him with an attention that was also looking at something else. Elsie's father, probably, and the thread between them, and the way things ended and began. "He has your eyes," she told Elsie. "Edgar's hands," Elsie said. "Look at them." Margaret looked. The baby's hands were curled against his chest in the compact way of new babies, but there was something in the quality of them, the shape and the promise of them, that was entirely his father's. Margaret looked at Edgar, who was standing in the doorway with coffee for both of them and an expression of modest pride that he was not quite managing to keep modest. "You did all right," Margaret told him. "She did the work," he said. "You did all right," Margaret repeated, with the firmness of a woman making a definitive statement, and Edgar, who was wise enough to accept a verdict from someone who had earned the right to give one, nodded. The years in Santa Fe built themselves the way good years do, not dramatically but substantially, layer by layer, in the way that stone is laid. The shop grew and Edgar took on an apprentice, a young man named Tomás who came from one of the old Santa Fe families and who learned quickly and well, and who treated Edgar with the specific respect of someone who recognized a master of his craft, which Edgar was and remained too modest to acknowledge. Tomás, for his part, was good company, bringing the shop a social energy that Edgar's natural quiet would not have generated on its own, and the shop became a place where the ranchers and freighters and townspeople gathered as much for conversation as for work. The store grew too, steadily and without drama, Elsie expanding it each year by exactly as much as the previous year's numbers supported, never overreaching, never underestimating. She hired Rosa permanently by the time James was a year old, and a second assistant named Concepcion the year after that. And by the time James was walking and talking in the mixed Spanish and English that all Santa Fe children seemed to acquire as a natural second language, the store had become a genuine institution in that part of town, and Elsie had become a woman the community regarded with the particular respect earned by competence and fair dealing across several years. She had not forgotten the injustices she had observed on the road. The Comanche and Kiowa families driven from their lands to the south and east, the calculated squeeze of people like herself out of small properties by those with larger means, the way the territory's Anglo settlement was displacing communities that had been there for generations. She could not fix these things, and she knew it, but she ran her business with the specific fairness of a woman who had understood dispossession from the inside out. And she was the store owner who did not charge more because she could, and who extended credit to the family that had the money coming but not yet, and who treated the Pueblo women who came in to trade with the same directness and respect she gave to the Anglo ranchers' wives. In a town that was negotiating its multiple inheritances in imperfect and often painful ways, she did not make it worse. 2 years after James was born, she told Edgar she was expecting again, and this time she told him in the store at noon, after Rosa had found a reason to be busy in the back room, and he received the news with the same quality of full attention, and then folded her into his arms right there in the middle of the store with complete disregard for the several people who happened to be passing outside the open door, and she leaned into it and let it be exactly what it was. The second child was a girl, born the following spring, in the easier morning labor of someone whose body remembered the work and did it with more efficiency the second time. They named her Clara, for Edgar's mother who had died before they met and whom he had loved completely, and the name pleased him in the specific way that honoring the dead pleases the living, a small necessary act of continuity. James was nearly 3 when Clara was born, and he regarded his sister with the serious scientific interest of a small person confronted with a novel phenomenon, and within a week he had concluded that she was acceptable and assigned himself the role of her protector with a gravity that made everyone who witnessed it feel, simultaneously, tender and amused. Edgar watched this development with an expression that was entirely new on him, a kind of deep private delight that he wore without embarrassment, and Elsie stored that expression away with all the other specific things she was collecting without intending to the evidence of a life that was genuinely, fully what she had not known she was looking for when she set out from Harlan Creek with her 2 bags tied to the gray mare's saddle. In the autumn of 1882, 4 years after they had left Texas, a letter came from Harlan Creek. It was from Mrs. Harkin, the woman on the front porch who had raised her hand as they rode out, and it was addressed to Elsie Garner Finley, care of Garner's Provisions, Santa Fe, NMT, which indicated that either Mrs. Harkin had tracked her down with specific effort, or that Mabel Prout's postal network was more far-reaching than it had any right to be. The letter said that old Herman Clasp, who had bought the store from Elsie, had died that summer, and that his estate was offering several of the properties he had accumulated, and that the original Garner store property was among them, and that Mrs. Harkin, who turned out to have a niece who had recently married and needed a commercial property, had wondered if Elsie wanted to buy it back before it went on the open market, as a matter of family sentiment. Elsie read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Edgar came home at noon and found her looking at it. He read it and set it down and looked at her. "Do you want it?" he asked. She considered the question with care, which was how she considered all questions that mattered. Did she want the store in Harlan Creek? She thought about the limestone building and the leaking roof and the ledger with the bad number at the bottom. She thought about her father moving through the store as a young girl followed him. She thought about what she had built here in Santa Fe in 4 years of focused and careful work. "No," she said finally, "I do not want it. I am glad it exists, but I am not going back for it." She paused. "I would like to write Mrs. Harkin and tell her I appreciate the thought." "Write her," he said. "I will mail it on my way back to the shop." She wrote the letter that afternoon, warm and clear, thanking Mrs. Harkin and wishing her niece well, and she sealed it and gave it to Edgar without rereading it, which was the confidence of a woman who had learned she could say what she meant the first time. That evening, after the children were asleep, James in his small bed with the flat efficiency of a child who had decided sleeping was a task, and he was going to complete it. Clara tucked against her stuffed horse with her hand curled under her cheek Elsie, and Edgar sat on the courtyard bench of their house in the October night, which was cool and lit with a 3/4 moon over the mountains to the east. They had bought this house the previous year, their own house, 3 rooms of good adobe with the kitchen garden and the stable and a courtyard that had a pinyon pine in it that dropped its sweet-smelling cones in October and sent the whole yard into a haze of resin and cold air. He had his arm around her, and she was leaning into his side in the particular way she had learned to lean into him, the way that was not dependence but something more specific, the particular fit of 2 people who have become one of the constants in each other's world. "Are you happy?" she asked. Not because she was anxious for the answer, but because she was in the habit of asking true questions, and because the answer, his actual answer, the one he would give because he said what he meant, was one of the things she most valued. He was quiet for a moment, which was always his version of taking the question seriously. "I am more than happy," he said. He said it simply, without inflection, in the way of a man stating a fact. I feel like I am where I was supposed to be. I did not know what that felt like before." He paused, looking at the mountains. "You said yes that day at my stable, and I thought, whatever comes next, I am going in the right direction. And then every day since then has been the right direction." She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, which beat with its steady, undramatic certainty. "I came to say goodbye to you," she said. "I had the whole speech prepared." "I know," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "What was in the speech?" "That I was grateful," she said. "That I hoped we had been friends, that I wished you well." She paused. "It was a very sensible speech." "It was a terrible speech," he said. "It was," she agreed. "I am glad you were already packed." He turned and kissed the top of her head, and she felt it the way she felt everything with him, fully, specifically, as a fact of her world and not a temporary condition. The October night was cold and beautiful around them, the pinyon tree dropping its cones softly in the dark, the mountains holding their blue distance against the stars. From inside the house, Clara made a small sound and then went quiet, resettling into her sleep. James, if past pattern held, would sleep until full morning without stirring. The horses moved quietly in the stable. The fountain in the courtyard, they had put one in, copying Margaret and Raphael when they bought the house, made its small constant sound. Somewhere in the years that had passed, Harlan Creek had become a memory rather than a wound, and the dry goods store with its bad ledger and the house with the leaking roof were simply the places where this had begun, the before of a long and continuing after. She thought of her father, as she often did, and felt him close in the way the dead are close when you have built something with what they gave you. She thought about the road, the cedar hills and the long plains, and the woman with the broken wagon wheel, and the boy Daniel who had watched Edgar's hands and learned something. She thought about the fire by the creek where she had kissed him for the first time, with the stars thick overhead. She thought about every mile of it, all 350, with the horses and the bedrolls and the trail coffee and the conversations that had never run dry. She thought about arriving. "I have been thinking," Edgar said, in the tone he used when he had been turning something over for a while, "that we should think about expanding the house, if there is going to be another one." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes with the careful steadiness that had not changed in 4 years, that she expected would not change in 40 more. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I am offering an observation," he said, "about practical matters." "What practical matters specifically?" "Specifically that Clara is 10 months old," he said, "and James is almost 3, and the house is the right size for us right now, and I thought it was better to think about it before it becomes urgent rather than after." He paused. "And I thought," and here the careful precision of him gave way to something warmer, something that was simply himself without any management, "that I would like there to be another one, if you would." Elsie looked at him, at this entirely real man in this entirely real life, in this courtyard in Santa Fe with the piñon tree and the fountain and the mountains and all 350 miles of road behind them, and she felt the specific happiness that was not a temporary state but a structure, something built properly with good materials and the right tools, something that would stand. "We can expand the house," she said. He held her a little closer, and she let herself be held, and the October night moved around them with its cold and its stars and its absolute indifference and its absolute beauty, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because some things did not need saying, and what was already said was already complete. And the life in front of them, with its rooms to build and children to raise and horses to shoe and ledgers to balance and evenings like this one to sit in, was exactly as large and as good as it needed to be. She thought once more about the morning she had ridden out to say goodbye, and how she had arrived at his stable with her speech prepared and her mind made up and found him already saddled, already packed, already turned in the direction of whatever came next, waiting with the patient certainty of a man who had made his decision and was ready to stand behind it. She had thought that day that she was arriving to end something. She had been wrong, and it was the best kind of wrong, the kind that happens when the world turns out to be larger and more generous than your most careful preparations accounted for, when the thing you thought you were setting down turns out to be the thing you were just beginning to pick up, when the goodbye becomes the beginning of the longest and truest and most specific happiness you have ever known. The fountain ran. The stars moved their slow arc over the mountains. Inside, the children slept. Edgar Finley and Elsie Garner Finley sat in the courtyard of their house in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1882, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and they knew it, and that knowledge was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world, the thing that neither of them had been able to name once, but that had been there all along, waiting with the patient permanence of deep water, waiting for the right moment to come up clean and cold and real into the light.